Support for WUWM podcast comes from Hop Harvest and Vine and Good Harvest Market in Pewaukee, part of One Destination, combining farm-to-table dining, local craft beers, and organic groceries under one roof. More at goodharvestmarket.com.
From 89.7 WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR, this is Lake Effect. I'm Audrey Nowakowski. Today we'll learn about underwater archaeology and why the Great Lakes are ideal for exploring.
Nobody had any idea that sites were submerged that would be intact, right? They're 9,000 years old. There's wooden trees that are still rooted in place because the cold fresh water is so good for preservation.
Then we'll speak with astrophysicist Neil DeGrasse Tyson about what he hopes for the future of science education.
If I had my choice, I would actually just stay in the lab, and you would never know I even existed. And in fact, I look forward to the day where other people, many more people, join this landscape of science education.
Plus, we'll look at the similarities between dinosaurs and the birds we see in our world today. That's coming up on Lake Effect. This is Lake Effect from 89.7 WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR. I'm Audrey Nowakowski. Thanks for joining us. Today's show looks at the many fields of science and discovery we have, from the ocean to the stars. When you think about archaeology, your mind probably went to a scene of an excavation site, probably in a dry landscape with hammers and dust and someone looking like Sam Neill in Jurassic Park. While archaeologists do uncover the ways people lived in the past below the surface through the places and artifacts they left behind, this is also done way below the surface, underwater. Underwater archaeology, or the study of submerged landscapes, is a relatively new field. In fact, UW-Milwaukee is just one of 2 underwater archaeology programs in the U.S. It's led by Associate Professor Dr. Ashley Lemke, whose previous work includes researching prehistoric hunter-gatherer sites in the depths of Lake Huron. Now, she's helping students explore similar submerged sites in Lake Michigan for the first time. To learn more, Lemke joins me now and begins by sharing how she first discovered the world of underwater archaeology.
I feel like I saw bits and pieces of it as a child without realizing what it was. Like The Little Mermaid is an underwater archaeologist.
Oh, that's so true.
Right?
Yes.
But it's not titled that, so you don't know. So when I was an undergraduate student in Texas, I was working in a lab and there was a guy there who was an underwater archaeologist, the first one I had met, and that's when I learned it was a real career.
Yeah, so what exactly does underwater archaeology entail?
Underwater archaeology entails, essentially, we're very interested in the human past. So we don't do dinosaurs and we don't do UFOs, which I think is very important. Anything that people did, though, that now has kind of wound up underneath water, that's what we're interested in. So most people think of shipwrecks. Of course, that's, what a lot of the underwater archaeological record is. But there's actually much older sites. There's cities, there's temples, there's all sorts of things that are submerged in the ocean.
Which is wild. Okay, so we're going Atlantis adjacent, right?
Yeah, exactly. but not UFOs.
But the Great Lakes.
Yeah.
So you actually started UW-Milwaukee's underwater archaeology program, and it's just one of a handful in the country. So what are you and your students focusing on? Is it Lake Michigan? Is it all the Great Lakes? Considering you're starting this, you have a lot of freedom, but I imagine you're like, okay, let's start with the focusing point we need.
Yeah, we mostly are focused on the Great Lakes. So because, hello, Milwaukee, you can't get in a better location to have this research institute, to go out. And so currently right now, my students, one's working in Lake Michigan, one just finished working in Lake Huron, one is working in Mexico, and another's working in the Atlantic Ocean. So we're Great Lakes focused, but we do underwater archaeology all over.
Okay, amazing. So let's get into some of the things you're looking for. So as you mentioned, there's prehistoric submerged sites, and this is kind of categorized as submerged landscape research. Can you describe that a bit more for us?
Yeah, submerged landscape research is one of these long academic words. What is this? So at the end of the last ice age, if we focus just on the Great Lakes for now, there were a lot lower water levels. So essentially, there's all sorts of environmental things that caused that. But, the glaciers kind of carved out the Great Lakes. They're slowly retreating up north. Then it's a more arid time around 10,000 years ago. And there are new river channels and water channels and all these things result in the lakes being much lower than they were. So that means there was a lot more dry land. And wherever there was dry land, people and plants and animals were living there. And it's now underwater.
Okay. So when we're talking about the research process, you mentioned you've been in town out on the boat for a few days. What does that entail? What kind of tools are you using to find landscapes that have been long submerged as you're out on the water?
We know more about the surface of Mars than we do about the bottom of Lake Michigan. It's one of my favorite facts. It's just so crazy because you'd think we'd know so much about the bottom and we don't. So most of our research starts out with just mapping the lake bed. We use side-scan sonar, multi-beam sonar, something called a sub-bottom profiler that actually penetrates below the lake bed to see if there's things that are buried there. So
how far below does that go?
It can go basically as far as bedrock,
Okay.
As far as we need it to go, with different kinds of resolution. So we're looking for things on the surface, we're looking for things that are buried, and we have to do a lot of that mapping ourselves as archaeologists because it's not all mapped, and sometimes what is mapped isn't mapped to the resolution that we would need to see archaeological sites. So we start with that, and then actually I've been out with some students from the St. Francis School District. We've been working on an underwater robot that they built.
Incredible.
So middle and high school students have built their own underwater robot for our underwater archaeological research, and so we've been testing her out in the lake the last several days.
Good, good. And you mentioned mapping is a big challenge. What other kind of challenges do you face to collect and interpret the research you're gathering, especially since it's kind of a relatively new field?
It is a new field, and there's a lot of people doing it, and we all get along, which is really great. So people share stories and ideas and methods. Honestly, weather is our biggest challenge, I would say, because oftentimes we're going quite far out into the middle of Lake Michigan. So you have to have a boat that can handle that. You have to have a boat with enough space and enough power, to run all this equipment. But you also just want to make sure you're safe and you're having a good day out there. So we just wait for the weather. I've got a bag packed at all times, and if the forecast looks good, we just go.
Now, you've been slowly working, establishing this program, exploring the Great Lakes. What are some of your biggest or most exciting discoveries in this position so far?
So for me, a lot of this actually is based on my work that I did in Lake Huron before I got here. So for over 12 years, I was working first as a student and then as a professor and then with my students on archaeological sites that are submerged in the middle of Lake Huron. It's a big collaborative project. We've worked with a lot of different people, and that discovered 9,000-year-old caribou hunting sites that are in over 100 feet of water in the middle of Lake Huron. So
what do those look like?
Yeah, they're really crazy. So they're made out of stone. They're kind of stone features. Caribou follow straight lines naturally, and prehistoric peoples knew that, and they just made lines out of what they had available, rocks and wood, and they hunted caribou really effectively that way. But nobody had any idea that people in the Great Lakes were hunting using those methods. Nobody had any idea that sites were submerged that would be intact, right? They're 9,000 years old. There's forest down there. There's wooden trees that are still rooted in place because the cold fresh water is so good for preservation. So the idea was I had this project. I'd been working in the Great Lakes for a lot longer, but Lake Huron is just one. All 5 of them experienced those lower water levels. All 5 of them have archaeological sites and no one's ever looked. So I came to Milwaukee to start that program so we can start doing that work in Lake Michigan.
That's excellent. And you made an interesting point about the water, because I would assume that water can deteriorate a lot of things, but the cold lake temp is the key to preserving all these sites?
Yeah, it's very counterintuitive. You would think that water, would erode or deteriorate wood, but when it's completely wet, then it preserves much better than if it were completely dry, or wet dry. Wet dry is very bad for organic materials, things like wood, like shipwrecks, right? Or trees or ancient plants. So water in general, submerged completely, is very good. That's why underwater archaeology is all over the world, because it preserves sites much better than on land. But fresh water is even better. Cold fresh water is even better. Deep cold fresh water is basically as good as you can get. So the Great Lakes are, we love them because they're challenging weather-wise, but they're absolutely worth the effort and the respect of working there because they have the best preservation conditions for archaeological sites.
Now, when you are scoping and scanning, what are some of the things that are easiest to spot that indicate to you, oh, this could be something?
I mean, don't tell anybody, just kidding. But shipwrecks are kind of easy.
Sure.
Only because I say that in jest.
Or if we're going more historical than that.
Yeah, historical, boats look like boats. You know, it's you don't know immediately which shipwreck it is, but they look different enough from the bottom. The real trick with looking at submerged landscapes is the landscape is what you're looking for, right? It's not so much like what's a big giant thing on top of it. Like people in the deep, deep past, so 9,000 or even, older than that, they built things, but they also moved around a lot. So you don't have like a pyramid underwater that we can find those big targets. We're looking for very small stone tools. So hopefully, if they build things like the hunting structures we found, we can see those on the surface when they're not buried. A lot of what we're looking for is kind of a landform. Like, would there have been fresh water here? Would there have been an overlook here good for hunting? So you kind of think about it from the environmental perspective first, and then you hypothesize where might prehistoric peoples have lived. And then you get in and kind of get down in more detail and more in the dirt and start excavating.
And I see this is kind of tied in with anthropology and, studies of past humans. You mentioned it's giving us new information about how they hunted, how they moved. What other underwater discoveries have you been a part of, or this field in general? What are they teaching us about our human histories?
I think what I always tell people, and this is true, like archaeology in general is like putting together a puzzle, but you don't have the picture on the box and you don't have all the pieces. So you already have this kind of creative aspect of it, but we're also scientists. So you're creating a hypothesis of what life was like with the past, but then underwater you have more of those pieces because the preservation is better. The other part of this is our stories aren't going to be complete if we don't look underwater. Like for hundreds of years, people have done archaeology and we make all these models and all these ideas of what we think life was in the past, but we're missing a lot of that story if we don't look underwater. So in the Great Lakes, we had those lower water levels where there was more land available for people to live. That happened all over the world on the continental shelves as well. So like 25%, right, of the land was just gone underwater. So there's so much more space. People like living on coast. I always tell people it's like, we'd all live on Lake Drive if we could. Like people in the past did that too. They wanted to live on shorelines, coastlines. They're really productive environments. They're beautiful, and so all of those shorelines are underwater now. So we don't know where a lot of those earliest peoples were living until we go and look underwater.
This is so incredible and fun to learn about. And you've been involved in this field, as you said, first in Lake Huron. Now you're at UWM for more Lake Michigan-focused stuff. But for you personally, what's the most fun and exciting part about being a professor for students in a newer field who are now learning about this opportunity through you when you pieced it together yourself?
It's phenomenal because when I was trying to do this, I went to the University of Michigan and they just started an underwater project, but they didn't have a program. And a lot of people, professors that are about my age, like we all kind of had to make it up as we went along. There wasn't like a place where you could go. And still UWM is one of two anthropology departments that teach submerged landscapes right now. So like
what's the other one?
Texas A&M.
Okay.
So you have Texas or you have Wisconsin and like that's it, right? There's programs for shipwrecks that are all over that are very good as well. But this focus on submerged landscapes is so new and there's so few people doing it that it's phenomenal. We have students applying quite literally from all over the world to come here, which is great. Overwhelming because there's so many of them and I want to take everybody. But for me, the most exciting thing is actually I've been working with the middle and high school students lately because they're so unbounded in their creativity and like they're just not stressed about anything. Like we would be like, oh, well, that's not going to work because it's expensive or like that won't work because of scheduling. And the students are like, let's just make it happen. And they're right. Like that's the attitude that we should have is like, this is a problem. This is something we all want to work together to do. Let's do it. So working with middle and high school students is something I've never done until I came to Milwaukee. So that's been phenomenal.
Well, and I can't wait to learn more about what you are going to discover in Lake Michigan here and your work here. But for today, Ashley, thank you so much for joining me on Lake Effect.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's been awesome.
Dr. Ashley Lemke is an archaeologist and associate professor for UW-Milwaukee's Anthropology Department. Neil deGrasse Tyson has many titles, but he's probably best known as your personal astrophysicist. You may have seen him as a guest on various news or late-night TV shows explaining the science we come across in daily life. Tyson is also an author, podcast host, and heads the Hayden Planetarium in New York City. But no matter the role he takes on from day to day, they all share one thing in common: popularizing science by making it accessible and exciting. Tyson joined me in 2023 when he was in Milwaukee to give a lecture. Neil deGrasse Tyson, welcome to Lake Effect. It's an honor to speak with you today.
Well, thank you. Thank you. And I like the name Lake Effect. Does that refer to the source of moisture that creates snow in the winter?
Yes, and right in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, we're right by Lake Michigan here, so we thought it was an appropriate name.
There it is. I love it. I love the meteorological innuendo there. So it's good.
Yeah, well, and of course, while I have you, and speaking of all things science, I want to start off with the concept of scientific literacy. What is it, and how do you think we can foster this not only in young children, but as adults as well?
Yeah, contrary to what many people think of me, I generally focus on adults rather than on children. Children are born curious. They're scientists, basically, minus the laws of physics and nature that they have yet to learn. They are as inquisitive as any adult scientist is about the natural world. So I don't actually worry about them. I worry about the adults who are teaching them later on. And I worry about what happens when you emerge into the ranks of what we would call educated citizens of the world. What happens is upon graduation, people ossify in whatever, but it doesn't matter what point you graduate. Is it high school or is it college or graduate school? Typically, people ossify right at the point when they graduated. And I've stereotyped this, but imagine people run down the steps, toss their books in the air and said, "School's out." There's even an Alice Cooper song that anthemically celebrates, "School's out for summer, school's out forever." And it's like, really, you're glad there's no more school? So that means there's a failure in the educational system to make it such that you are glad when you no longer have to learn. So that's a first. Let's just start there. More specifically about science, we're taught just what science knows in our classes. You get this fat textbook and you got to memorize the bold-faced words. That's the vocabulary. And you take the test and then you move on. And at no time are we really taught what science is or how and why it works. That's what's missing.
Is that the start of the disconnect? So, school's out, and then as adults, there's, I guess maybe only a matter of time, but before that failure and disconnect starts, where we seem to forever be facing, especially in the past few years, where people don't agree what is science, when, how it works, what's an objective truth, what does it mean to be convinced of something? Do you think this is where the failure starts, is when we think, oh, we don't need this knowledge anymore, let me carry on?
Well, not only do they think they don't need it, but when they did learn the science, they didn't learn science the way science is actually practiced, which is on the frontier. It's a messy, bloody, well, not bloody, but it's a messy, confused frontier because you don't know what's going to come down the pipe. And so someone does some research and they get a result. Somebody else doesn't, and the press runs to it, by the way. Someone else gets another result that's different, and they report on that. And then the public thinks that the scientists don't know what we're doing when they're being exposed to the very frontier where objective truths are being sifted and established. And so if the CDC gives, holding aside political issues or communication challenges that they had, if the CDC announces something based on research 1 month, and then they announce something different or improved or slightly altered, you can't say, well, I don't know what to believe then. Because if you say that, it means you don't know how science works. Science is an ever progressing approach towards an objective truth, which when you get multiple studies that agree, and I'm not talking about opinions here, I'm talking about results of data and observations and experiment. When they agree, then we say, we got a new truth, put it in the books and let's keep moving forward. And in the era of experimental science, that's how we built civilization, to deal with it. And don't tell me I don't trust science. Oh, wait a minute. I got a call on my smartphone from someone 4,000 miles away. Oh, and let me find out what the shortest distance is to grandma's house in traffic on my smartphone. Oh, but I don't trust science. Really? Really?
So speaking of...
I'm trying to get all excited about that, but that's my answer.
No, it's a good thing to get excited about. And A lot of things have influenced you in your life before you became known as, our personal astrophysicist. And one big component of that was studying under Carl Sagan. And he was a professor of astronomy at Cornell when you first met him. And one of your many takeaways from learning from Carl was, quote, "If I'm ever as remotely as famous as Carl Sagan, I'll treat the next generation of scientists the way he has treated me." So can you share some of those tenets you've developed over your career based on this promise you made to yourself?
Yeah. So Carl Sagan was not a mentor to me in the traditional sense we might think of that word. It's possible to mentor someone even if you never interact with them, just by example. All right. And in Carl Sagan, by the way, just to be clear, I was probably in his presence maybe 6 times in my life. Okay. So it's mostly just the impact someone can have when there's this sort of resonance between your goals and the wisdom that they share with you. And so he spent time with me when I was 17 years old. He didn't know me from anything. I'd applied to Cornell, had not decided whether I would attend, and the admissions office sent him my application, which was dripping with the universe. And they said, maybe this is somebody. So he invited me up. And I went there. I said, my gosh, how do you do what? What? And he handed me a book he wrote and signed it. And drove me at the end of the day, drove me back to the bus station. It's upstate New York. It began to snow. This was in December. And he said, if the bus can't get through, here's my home number. Call me, spend the night with my family, leave tomorrow. I was like, what? And I said, oh my gosh, he's investing in the future, in me. So I kind of, like I said, if I'm ever that famous, I remember thinking this at the time, I will give attention to the next generation of students who want to do what I'm doing. I will give them the attention above all else. So I joke about this. I'd be on the phone and a student knocks on the door of my office. I say, Barack, I got to get back to you. I got a student. I'll call you later. I got students I got to deal with here. So it's infused almost every aspect of my pedagogical hat wearing. When I'm separate from being a scientist, I count myself among the ranks of educators, and that's in my portfolio for sure.
Do you consider being an educator as one of your key priorities? Would you say if this all went away, public speaking, being the people's astrophysicist, would teaching still be plenty to fulfill you?
Well, so no, I'm a little more complicated than that. If I had my choice, I would actually just stay in the lab and you would never know I even existed. And in fact, I look forward to the day where other people, many more people, a lot are there now, join this landscape of science education. If you look on social media, there are many people who have entire YouTube channels and Instagram streams devoted to doing cool science things at home, learning about science. So there's a swell in the ranks of those who are active in these efforts. So what I want to do is have that be large enough so that I can tiptoe backwards, exit the back door, go to the Bahamas, and you won't even know I left. And so I'm happy to have done contributed the bit that I have, but it can't just be all needle all the time. Then my efforts will have failed if people learning science requires that I be a part of that equation. Then it didn't work. And just the way Carl tried to make sure he didn't have to be part of that equation. All right. If you provided you pass the torch and keep it going. So no, and I don't need to be remembered for any of that. Just keep moving forward. It's not about me. It's about you.
So let's say you had to move out of the sciences and being in the lab wasn't an option and you had to pick a job in the humanities. What field would you choose and why?
Oh, yeah. Great. Thanks for that question. Does it matter if I have talent in that?
No. Let's just say a dream job that's not related, whatever. Yeah.
Thanks for that. I think I would be a songwriter for Broadway musicals. That's what I love. I love musicals, even the corny ones. Two people meet each other and they fall in love, and there's a moment where they can no longer express it in words, so they have to sing a song. I remember as a kid saying, that's stupid. If you just feel that way, why sing a song? Why are you wasting my time? I remember it as a kid, but then I realized, oh my gosh, a song reaches deeper into our state of emotion and into our feelings. Songs go beyond words in ways that affect us viscerally. And so as I became more and more facile with the language, with words, with communication, really, I said to myself, I want to participate in that exercise. And I want to write the simple song that conveys not only ideas, but emotions and advances the plot. And so, yeah, so that's what I would be.
I love that answer. One more question for you in the time I have. Speaking of visceral memories, do you have a favorite stargazing memory or any other kind of related scientific memory?
Oh, of course. Yeah. So in the old days, because that's how old I am, we would go on pilgrimages to mountaintops to the telescopes. Okay. The theorists would stay at home on their computers. I was a little bit of both. So I would go to mountaintops, and they're far away. I went to mountains in the Andes Mountains of Chile for my PhD thesis. And you're there, and you takes a day or two, do you convert and you live nocturnally. So your day is the night. Your day begins at sunset. All right. And I'm there, and I'd be listening to music, typically some bombastic classical bit. And as the morning draws near, it's a full night of observing and data gathering, I would time it so that like the final chords of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony would be playing as the dome slit closed. And, and then I'd walk out and I'd see dawn. Those are you have to feel that and experience it it's almost a spiritual encounter with the cosmos when you have that. So the music, the data, the science, the sky, the mountaintop, it's all there.
Yeah.
Wouldn't trade it for anything.
Well, Neil deGrasse Tyson, I want to thank you so much for joining me today. It was an absolute pleasure to talk to you.
And thanks for having me, man.
Neil deGrasse Tyson is an astrophysicist, author, podcast host, and the head of the Hayden Planetarium in New York City. We spoke in 2023 when he was in town for a lecture. Need some flexibility for when you listen? You can hear Lake Effect on demand. Find it as a podcast wherever you like to listen, to download and enjoy on the go. In about 15 minutes, we'll learn about the discovery of gravitational waves and how UW-Milwaukee played a role. But first, we'll talk about the dinosaurs and all the ways they're connected to the birds we see in the skies today. Keep listening to Lake Effect on Milwaukee's NPR. You're listening to Lake Effect on 89.7 WUWM. I'm Audrey Nowakowski. Dinosaurs are thought to have dominated the Earth for more than 150 million years. We're still learning about how they lived and what caused them to disappear from the Earth. Dr. Jing-May O'Connor is the Associate Curator for Fossil Reptiles at the Field Museum in Chicago. She joins Lake Effect's Joy Powers to talk about dinosaurs and their connection to the birds we see in our world today.
Is it fair to say that birds are essentially dinosaurs?
Yes, 100% birds are living dinosaurs. So all of us, when we've looked out the window and seen a bird fly by, we are literally seeing dinosaurs alive today.
It's a little crazy thinking about that, in part because as I was going through my notes preparing for this interview, this is a theory that was posited a really long time ago and a long time before it was accepted. What was the turning point where people started to see that straight line between dinosaurs and birds?
I think the reason that this idea took so long to be fully accepted is two reasons. One is that there was very limited evidence when this idea was first proposed, like over 150 years ago. And it was this new evidence that came to light in the 1990s that provided tangible, irrefutable evidence that birds are, in fact, a living lineage of dinosaurs. And I think the other reason that it's been really difficult and why there are still a few holdouts within the scientific community is simply because it's so difficult for us to wrap our minds around the idea that dinosaurs are still alive. We've been taught over and over and over again, dinosaurs are extinct, but they're not. In fact, there's more species of birds now than there are species of mammals. So dinosaurs are alive and well. And I think that's just a really difficult concept for people to grasp sometimes.
One of the things that I think is difficult for people is this idea that dinosaurs, many, probably had feathers. And we have this picture in our minds of, these scaly, I don't want to say lizard-like, but more reptilian than bird-like, these scaly animals that now we're having to reimagine with feathers.
Yeah, well, so birds are dinosaurs and dinosaurs are reptiles, right? So that is another thing that we were all taught, that there's mammals, reptiles, and birds. But in fact, now we know birds are a group of reptiles. Now, in terms of which dinosaurs are feathered, you don't have to feather them all. The feathers that we see in living birds are a very derived characteristic. So this means it's a very complex structure that evolved only in one lineage of dinosaurs. Now, it does seem that the primitive condition in dinosaurs, and also in the common ancestor between dinosaurs and pterosaurs, which are these other flying reptiles that often get lumped with dinosaurs, but are in fact not dinosaurs, their common ancestor had what we call proto-feathers. So they are the evolutionary beginning of what will eventually become the complex feather we see in living birds. So we see these features in pterosaurs and also in some dinosaurs, but big dinosaurs like the long-necked sauropods, they were completely covered in scales. But when you move into theropod dinosaurs, which are your bipedal carnivorous dinosaurs like Sue the T-Rex or Deinonychus, and as you evolve through these dinosaurs into the groups that are more and more closely related to birds, you start to see more and more feathers and more complex feather structures until you eventually evolve this modern feather that we see in living birds that has that central spine that we call the rachis, and it has these barbs sticking off either side that you can pull apart and then like zip back together. So that type of feather had to evolve before you could then evolve them into overlapping structures to form a wing that can then be used to fly, which is, of course, one of the major characteristics that we associate with avian dinosaurs.
This idea of dinosaurs flying, we do have, of course, a section that I think the general public will go, okay, yes, some dinosaurs flew, but that group may be much larger than we once believed.
Yeah. So, one thing that we're first still trying to get people to really understand is that birds are flying dinosaurs. But one of the newest and most exciting things that we have discovered in paleontology just within the past 5 years is that birds were not the only flying dinosaurs. So we actually still don't know which group of dinosaurs, non-avian dinosaurs, birds are most closely related to. We think maybe it's troodontids, but we don't really know. And one of the reasons why it was really difficult for us to try to figure out which group of dinosaurs then evolved into birds was because actually a lot of dinosaurs were involving flight, and things that we think of as an avian characteristic is actually better referred to as a aerodynamic characteristic. So we would look at these dinosaurs and be like, that is a bird-like feature. Now we know that that dinosaur has bird-like features because it is also flying, but it evolved flight independent of the avian lineage. So flight evolved at least 4 times in dinosaurs, all roughly around the same time, between 165 and 120 million years ago. I mean, it's just really crazy to think about all these different dinosaurs with different types of wings, flying in different ways, kind of, like the diversity of flying mammals that we see today, where you have bats with powered flight, but you also have things like flying squirrels and many other mammals that use gliding flight. So the same diversity was present in dinosaurs.
So this is an odd theory that I came upon while researching for this conversation. This theory suggests that the T-Rex's most distinguishing feature, or at least one of them, the tiny arms, may not have been arms at all, but wings. Is there evidence to actually support that?
Yeah, definitely not. So one thing that's really interesting, the wing, if you feathers arranged on the arm, forming a structure that looks like a wing. This is something that evolved in dinosaurs for another purpose. We don't really know what. And then evolution hijacked this feature and used it for flight multiple times in these different flying dinosaurs. But when you look at the earliest arms with these wing-like feathers, you can see that the proportions of the arms relative to the body is, definitely tells you the animal's not fine. Basically, they have really tiny arms and really long legs. So the surface area formed by that proto-wing cannot generate enough lift to make the animal that is that size airborne. So that is one reason that I would say, based just on the skeletal proportions of T-Rex, there's no way you could ever say that's a wing. But beyond that, this derived feather that I keep talking about with what we call a pennaceous feather, the type of feather you see in living birds, that feather had not evolved in the Tyrannosaurus grade of theropod evolution. So we do know that relatives of T-Rex had proto feathers, but they definitely did not have this advanced pennaceous feather morphotype, which then allows you to overlap and make these big structures. So if T-Rex had feathers, which is controversial, I think it did, it had proto feathers, but they would have just been like fuzzy bristles that probably maybe were only along its back, forming kind of like a spiky crest that might have been used for attracting mates or something like that. But definitely we can rule out wings.
Very interesting. So, understanding that birds really are a kind of dinosaur, what kind of insight does that give us into dinosaurs more generally?
Well, it allows us to use birds as what we call extant analogs, basically living analogs, to understand better the biology of extinct dinosaurs. So we can dissect birds and we can look at their metabolic rates, and we can look at the way they breathe and the way they digest. And it can help us to better understand what dinosaurs were like when they were alive. And I think that's something that's really important and really kind of revolutionary. And if you think about birds and you look at them and the way that they move, their head moves so fast. And I mean, honestly, they kind of scare me when you really look at a bird and it's looking at you. And then you imagine, a T-Rex like that, which we actually know that it had a brain that allowed it to track movement, like with its eyes very quickly, the same way we see in living birds. Actually, T-Rex had vision better than an eagle. All these, biological aspects of these extinct animals that we can extract from looking at living dinosaurs that helps us bring these extinct dinosaurs to life actually makes them even more terrifying, if you ask me. And so I definitely have more than a decent dose of fear when it comes to birds.
Jingmei, thank you so much for joining us here on Lake Effect and sharing your work.
It was my pleasure. Thank you so much, Joy.
Dr. Jingmei O'Connor is the Associate Curator for Fossil Reptiles at the Field Museum in Chicago. She spoke with Lake Effect's Joy Powers when she came to the Milwaukee Public Museum in 2022. We'll take one more break, and when we come back, we'll learn about UW Milwaukee's role in research around black holes. Keep listening to Lake Effect on WUWM. This is Lake Effect on WUWM. I'm Audrey Nowakowski. Gravitational waves are ripples in space-time caused by cosmic collisions. By processing massive amounts of data, UW-Milwaukee scientists played key roles in the discovery, leading to a Nobel Prize in Physics. The discovery of gravitational waves opened a new door of study, and this work continues in our backyard today. To learn more about the significance of the discovery, I'm joined by UWM Physics and Astronomy Assistant Professor Leah Medeiros. What are gravitational waves?
So, to understand gravitational waves, we have to understand just a little bit of Einstein's theory of gravity. And what Einstein's theory of gravity says is that we all live in a four-dimensional space, and that is called space-time. So we have three dimensions of space, but we are also moving through time as well. And Einstein's theory really does require that we think about space and time as two parts of the same thing. And what this theory states is that mass can actually curve space-time itself, which I know might sound a little counterintuitive, but what we experience as gravity actually fundamentally is the curvature of space-time itself. And then in turn, the curvature of space-time tells matter how to move. And so the way that I like to define a black hole, for example, is that a black hole is a region of spacetime where the curvature is so extreme that nothing can escape, not even light itself. And so when we're talking about gravitational waves, most come from the merger of two black holes. It doesn't have to be black holes, but that's what most of them are. So since black holes curve space-time, if they are spiraling around each other and merging into one bigger black hole, effectively two black holes will collide into each other and create a bigger black hole. As they are spiraling around each other, they effectively drag that space-time curvature that they're creating with themselves as they move, and that effectively creates these ripples in space-time itself that propagate outward at the speed of light. And so we can actually detect these very, very, very tiny ripples in space-time itself. Space actually contracts and expands just ever so slightly, and we can actually detect that.
So, from what I'm understanding, gravitational waves, maybe I'm thinking too large scale. It's like the ripples are the waves, right? These little detections that you're picking up from these black holes colliding.
Yeah, so what we actually detect as the gravitational waves is a really, really incredibly tiny effect. What's really funny, I think, if you look historically, is that the scientific papers that were published about gravitational waves originally, even in those papers, they effectively acknowledge the fact that this is an interesting calculation and it's an interesting result, but there's just absolutely no hope of us ever detecting that. It's just a curiosity. And so it's really, really incredible to kind of look back historically and to realize that we have really surpassed the expectations of those scientists so many years ago when they first discovered that the theory of general relativity, Einstein's theory of gravity, predicted these gravitational waves.
Yeah, and it's really exciting to live and see the progress and see it continue on further. So, to go back to the discovery, the detection of gravitational waves, how were they discovered and how did UWM play a role in this?
Yeah, so UWM has been really important and really influential in the field of gravitation since the 70s. We've had a lot of really important professors and scientists who worked at UWM contribute really significantly to this field. And so since the 1970s, we had here Leonard Parker, who worked on gravitation, and his work actually laid the foundation for Hawking's theory of Hawking radiation, which is incredibly influential and important. And then in the 90s, we had John Friedman and Bruce Allen, who also really, really influential and important in the field of gravitational waves. And in the 90s, UWM made a really major commitment to gravitational wave research and hired three additional professors, Alan Wiseman, Julian Creighton, and Patrick Brady, all of whom are still here and very active to this day. And with these new hires in the 90s, UWM was able to build one of the strongest theory groups within the LIGO collaboration. And LIGO, of course, is a international collaboration that detected gravitational waves for the first time, and it has thousands of members globally.
And LIGO stands for?
LIGO stands for Laser Interferometer Gravitational Wave Observatory. And effectively, LIGO is made up of actual instruments here on Earth that are the interferometers, and they detect really, really tiny infinitesimal expansion or contraction of space-time itself. And through that detection are able to learn a lot about the black holes that actually collided and generated these gravitational waves.
So it's really cool and interesting and widely unknown, maybe unfairly, that we have this massive hub of black hole and gravitational discovery in our backyard, and that UWM is one of the key places for this. You mentioned LIGO. There's also a couple other groupings at the CGCA Center that contribute to this kind of work. Let's address some of that, and starting with nanograv. This is specifically for pulsars. Can you explain the work that nanograv does?
Yeah, so LIGO detects gravitational waves from black hole mergers of black holes that are, maybe on the order of 10 to 100 or so times the mass of the sun. And nanograv uses different techniques and can detect mergers of what we call supermassive black holes, that are black holes that have millions or even billions of times the mass of the sun. And the way that nanograv actually does that is, instead of having a physical instrument here on Earth, they use these really kind of crazy, incredibly compact stars called pulsars. And by measuring the time delay for the light that reaches the Earth from these pulsars, they can actually detect gravitational waves coming from mergers of supermassive black holes. And then more recently, just within 2025, I've also joined the CGCA and joined UWM, and I work on the Event Horizon Telescope. And that's also a global large-scale collaboration that focuses on gravity and black hole research. And what we do is we use a collection of telescopes spread around the world to take images of black holes and also learn more about black holes themselves and gravity through these images.
So this discovery 10 years ago opened a whole new door, a whole new field into gravitational wave astronomy and the wide array of physics to test and have in this hub. So can you share what kind of information gravitational waves and gravity and black holes do they hold that wasn't found in other space objects that makes this discovery so significant and has opened up these new doors?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. The way that I like to talk about this actually is kind of from my personal experience of how I've grown up within this field. When I started my PhD, I wanted to use black holes in space to test our understanding of gravity itself. And that just wasn't something that humans had ever done before. And the very first detection of gravitational waves happened when I was in the first few years of my PhD. And that really did kind of mark the dawn of a new era of black hole astrophysics. And since then, we have just learned so much about gravity itself, but also learned so much about the kinds of black holes that are out there, what their mass distributions are, how frequently they merge, how they grow, how they evolve. Just so much information. It's really been kind of like night and day before and after these free collaborations that I mentioned earlier came online and had their first detections. So, it's kind of a new subfield of astrophysics that we're all very excited about. And of course, UWM is playing a really significant role in this new field. And it really is just, we're effectively using black holes in space as a really extreme laboratory to test our most fundamental physics theories, which again is incredibly powerful, incredibly exciting, and not something that we were able to do just a few years ago.
Could you highlight for me maybe one or two other discoveries that were made possible because of the detection of gravitational waves?
Yeah, so I'll mention a couple things. So, one of the things that's really powerful and exciting for us is the fact that we were able to show that gravitational waves travel at the speed of light. Because they travel at the speed of light, it actually is a really powerful constraint on our understanding of gravity itself. And it shows that Einstein's theory of gravity does seem to really precisely predict the reality of the universe. And so that's really incredible. Something else that's been really exciting for us is the fact that before the very first gravitational wave detection, we had never actually really directly detected a binary black hole. And so when I say binary black hole, what I mean is just two black holes orbiting around each other. And so the very first detection also signified the very first time that we were really able to show that black holes do actually orbit each other, and it is possible for them to merge into one bigger black hole.
It's amazing learning more about black holes because they're always, for the general population, seen in movies, big, ominous things, right? And then the science of learning more and breaking it down, and also the fact that gravitational waves confirmed E equals mc squared 100 years after Einstein wrote it out. As the newest faculty of the CGCA, what are you most excited about? What are you looking forward to in your new role here in Milwaukee?
I'm really excited for a few results that I am currently working on with my collaboration. So we published the first image of a black hole on April 10th of 2019. And then we published the first ever image of the black hole at the center of our own galaxy in 2022. And I was very involved in both of those results. And in 2023, I published an updated version of that very first image. And in that updated version, what I did was I reanalyzed the raw data that we get from the telescopes with a machine learning algorithm. And I was able to achieve effectively a factor of 2 improvement in resolution for that image, which is really exciting. If you're interested, the algorithm is called Primo, and you can find a lot of information online about that. And so what I'm personally excited about is that I'm about to publish a new version of Primo that has a lot of new capabilities, and I hope in the next few years will allow us to have a high resolution movie of a black hole so that we can really see how matter swirls around the black hole and learn a lot more about how matter interacts with the gravitational field of the black hole and how it falls in.
That sounds awesome. I look forward to having you back when you have these updated images to talk more about it. But for today, thank you so much for joining me to talk about the anniversary of gravitational waves.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been wonderful.
Leah Medeiros is an assistant professor at UW-Milwaukee in the Physics and Astronomy Department and a member of the Center for Gravitation, Cosmology, and Astrophysics. We spoke last year to mark the 10-year anniversary of the discovery of gravitational waves. And that wraps up Lake Effect for today. I'm Audrey Nowakowski. If you've missed any of the show this week, you can find all of our conversations at wuwm.com. If you'd like to take Lake Effect on the go, just download our podcast wherever you like to listen to your podcasts. Kids in Milwaukee and across the country go hungry more often when school is out. Tomorrow on Lake Effect, we'll look at how free summer meal programs are used to fill the gap. Thank you so much for joining us today, right here on listener-supported 89.7 WUWM Milwaukee's NPR.